to me that EPA and IG have shown that better coordination and communication can help agencies.
I rise to speak on behalf of H.R. 2615, the Virgin Islands of the United States Centennial Commission Act.
Good day and welcome to the Washington Report with Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett. I'm Stacey Plaskett and I'm blessed to serve as the Virgin Islands delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. It has been a while since our last show. Much has happened since August in the Virgin Islands. We were devastated by 2 Category 5 hurricanes, and we've been working on recovery and ensuring Virgin Islanders get what they're needed. But now we will be exciting to show you what's happening in the future. As a reminder, the Washington Report was created to inform Virgin Islanders on current federal issues that directly affect our community. The show's guests will range from political leaders to community activists. This show is all about getting information to you. Therefore, I encourage you to email your questions to askstacy@mail.house.gov to have them answered on the future shows. Now I'd like to introduce my guest today, Douglas Domenech, Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs in the Department of Interior. Doug was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate and sworn in by President Trump September 2017. Doug, whose family is from Puerto Rico, holds a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Wildlife Management from Virginia Tech University and previously served as the Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia, overseeing 6 state environmental, recreational, and historic resource agencies. During the George W. Bush administration, Mr. Domenech also served as the White House liaison and Deputy Secretary of Staff to the Interior Secretaries Gail Norton and Doug Kempthorne. In addition, he served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs. Thank you for being with us today, Secretary.
It's great to be with you.
Assistant Secretary, can you please describe the role of the Office of Insular Affairs and the jurisdiction it has over the U.S. territories? That's often not quite well known by people.
Sure, and once again, I'm glad to be with you. The office is very interesting. We actually have jurisdiction over 4 of the 5 U.S. territories. So that's the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas Islands. And we also lead the federal government in its relationship with the freely associated states. So those are independent nations in the Pacific, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So our role with those areas is to facilitate the government-to-government relationship. We work with the governors in all the territories, and we have a very broad sort of policy-making, policy coordinating role, trying to be advocates for the territories within the government and trying to help solve problems for local leaders, for instance, in the Virgin Islands.
Now, often people try and see it more as an overseer over the territory, but you said you're more as an advocate. Can you tell me the difference with that in your mind?
Yeah, in our mind, we don't really think of it as overseer. It's Virgin Islanders have elected their own leadership. They've elected you, they've elected Governor Mapp, and those are the elected leaders who run the territory. Our role is much more facilitating that relationship with the federal government, trying to be a help to the territory, and again, an advocate internally to get things done, just because we've got the relationships with the federal family. And so we do that. After the storm, I was also asked to lead the FEMA effort on the natural and cultural resource recovery. So broadly speaking, on our staff we have former Senator Basil Otley. He's been down to the Virgin Islands many times, almost constantly since the storm, doing whatever he could do to help facilitate that sort of FEMA government relationship based on his knowledge. And so we've been very active with FEMA trying to help on the recovery. On the natural and cultural resource side, I specifically am leading, it's slightly different, but all the other agencies in restoring the natural areas that were disturbed. So that's everything from coral reefs to the national parks, for instance, and as well as trying to identify what needs to be done on the cultural side. So think historic houses that are on the list of historic places. Think archives, museums, things like that is a specialty that Interior deals with, so I'm working on that as well.
So, and you just talked about your visit to the Virgin Islands. What were your thoughts on the recovery efforts, and what can residents of the Virgin Islands expect in the near future when it comes to resources dedicated to rebuilding the territory and your own relationship with that?
Sure. I would say unclear. Exactly what's going to happen. We're all waiting for the third supplemental to be approved by Congress,
Right.
which will obviously target, we hope, needed funds both for Puerto Rico and for the Virgin Islands.
And we're hoping that that's more on the rebuilding side,
yes,
and
the
moving
recovery.
away from the recovery.
Right. As I said earlier, actually the way FEMA sort of looks at it, the initial effort that they put into helping is they call it the response phase. You know, water, getting the power back, all that kind of thing. And then the recovery side is all those other elements. How are we going to get the hospitals up and running? How are we going to get the natural cultural stuff done? And so they're moving into that phase, both in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The money, I know that FEMA has already, they released the numbers of funds they've already expended, and I think they're upwards of $600 million in the Virgin Islands for everything from loans to other areas. And but that's really not the kind of funding that we think the Virgin Islands needs. We're obviously advocating for them to get whatever they can to build new schools, new hospitals, all the types of things. The roads,
exactly.
Bury the lines for power, all that kind of stuff.
Creating resilience.
Exactly. And so we're really looking and trying to work hand in hand with territorial
So you'd be
government.
working then with the government of the Virgin Islands
Yes.
and advocating with the agencies here so that when the budget and the negotiations for those things take place, that we're considered for that.
Yeah.
Great. So in 2015, the Department of Interior, through Insular Affairs, worked on resiliency at that time in terms of climate change and really trying to prepare the Virgin Islands and other territories in that area. What is going to be, you think, this administration's stance on that, and how is that going to continue? Do you think the goals of the past were met, and what could be done differently, and how might you make that a little different in this administration?
It's a good question. I'm not as familiar with what was done before we got here in terms of that, but I know, for instance, on the energy front, we did a lot of work in all the territories with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, in creating plans to make the energy sector more resilient. And resiliency.
And what does that practicably mean to people?
Well, it depends, and it depends on what you mean by resiliency. When I hear the governors of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands talk about resiliency today, they're mostly talking about storm resiliency. We're going to get these storms. How am I going to make if we're going to rebuild, how can we rebuild these things so that they're resilient to big storms? And then, of course, there's another side is climate resiliency, which is how do we change what we do to be more resilient to a changing climate? Of course, the climate is changing, and we need to be prepared for that no matter what the
So how would that then be different than storms? So what you're talking about is rising sea levels, maybe? Are you talking about corrosion in areas? What does that mean?
Well, it's
in an island.
Well, an island is obviously very vulnerable to sea level rise. And it's been generally speaking, the seas have been rising for about a foot every 100 years already. So it's something that obviously islands are used to in that kind of time frame. But they're going to be low level islands that are going to be impacted. I just got back from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and their islands are really coral atolls, so they're right at sea level. And so they have a particular problem with overwash and occasionally king tides that affect them already because just they're so low lying. A little different than the beautiful islands the picture here that we have behind us. But of course, it is happening, and so it's something that we need to look at in terms of are we going to eventually have to build seawalls, or what exactly is that going to be in terms of if you're going to build a dock? Are we going to build them higher at this point? The Navy's already doing that in Norfolk. They've replaced all their docks and made them a little higher. I don't know the exact number. So those are definitely issues that we have to consider.
So was that what you think Interior and Insular Affairs were working on previously, was rethinking how we build things, how we look at how the islands are going to look moving forward 100 years from now?
Probably not quite there. And again, I don't know what the starting question was, but for instance, I know that they worked to build the solar arrays that were in St. Croix, and it might have been some other places too. I'm not exactly sure. And it's interesting, for instance, you go back.
Some worked.
That's
and
exactly
some
right. Yeah. We want to go back and look at those and say, okay, well, who installed this one that made it not blow away, and who installed the other one that didn't work?
So we can learn. A lot of the solar water heating panels, though, on people's homes did make it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is interesting as well. Is it because they were newer constructions on homes that maybe had newer roofs, or?
It's a good question.
And those are all things that Interior would help us, because you guys provide a lot of technical support, right?
We provide funding to the Virgin Islands in a couple of different categories, and technical assistance is one of those. Of course, we have a very small relative budget. We're always asking Congress to help with that, but we allocate about $5 million a year, which isn't, again, not that much, to target technical assistance to projects on the island, as well as we have a maintenance grant funding and an infrastructure funding mechanism. So people apply, and I say people, government primarily applies, or nonprofits, they also qualify. The other bucket is we actually facilitate the rum cover-over funding that goes to the Virgin Islands, and that's $200+ million a year, and that funding does come through Interior.
Now, I know this isn't, something that we talked about when you talked about the rum cover-over funding and managing it, and the technical support. Immediately, I was thinking, with this money that's coming in terms of rebuilding, is there a potential that Interior will be the ones managing and having some say in how that money is allocated?
It might be, and we're willing to do that. We've told Congress we'd be willing to do it if that was a better option for them. I think they're struggling. It's interesting, both Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico sort of are in a different spot in terms of trust of the government. So Puerto Rico is clearly having some trust problems. I mean, they were already basically in bankruptcy before the storm.
And then they have the oversight board.
And they have the oversight board.
But the oversight board is really looking at financing and how to repay their bond debt.
Yes.
And do they have the technical expertise to determine how infrastructure is built, right?
Exactly.
But Interior does have some of that expertise within.
So we're doing work both in both territories.
Even though you don't have oversight over Puerto Rico, right? Or you don't have advocate for Puerto Rico. Because they report to the White House.
Correct. They accept in the FEMA world, this me being in charge of the natural cultural resource side, I am working with we have a team in the Virgin Islands, a team in Puerto Rico. I just got back from Puerto Rico working with the team. We visited a number of sites that were in that natural and cultural resource side. But so I am involved in that regard. I also serve on the Conservation Trust of Puerto Rico, so I'm part of that mission. And speaking of Puerto Rico, I think I've told you this before, my first trip to the Virgin Islands, I was going to high school in Puerto Rico, and my football team played Charlotte O'Malley.
Who won?
You have to ask. They did. Or I should say you did.
Go Chicken Hawks.
There you go. So I've been going down there since high school. But that's what, of course, you're from there. You're used to seeing the beautiful islands, and it broke all of our hearts to see these storms and the conditions that were there afterwards.
So speaking of the beauty and natural resources, the Virgin Islands National Park is a significant part of the Virgin Islands landscape, both the land and underwater. And the park is a major attraction for our tourism industry. What role can the Department of Interior and the National Park Service play in educating individuals both on the mainland and abroad about the islands and their historic significance?
Well, you're right, and as you know, Secretary Zinke, Secretary of the Interior, made a commitment to you and to the governor to do everything we could do to open the parks back as soon as possible, because they are such a tourist driver. And so, as you know, they're all open now, and we opened them. I think it was December 1 we announced that they were back open. Of course, limited amenities, and nothing's been really rebuilt, but at least opening the beaches, allowing people to enjoy what was there before, because they are such a jewel for everybody. It's interesting, my perspective is that Americans know more about the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico now more than they ever have before because of the storm. And that's the one side, maybe the only benefit of being in the news every day, was that people know about it more and more.
And recognizes as being part of the United States.
Yes, exactly. And so, so that's not only Virgin Islands National Park on St. John, but of course it's the facilities in St. Croix, both Fish and Wildlife and National Park Service facilities there. So it was a top priority for us to get them open. Of course, we promote the Virgin Islands on our sites for Insular Affairs, and included as part of the National Park Service work. But we love to promote the islands. It's where people should go.
Well, you know, it's an interesting time for the national parks in the Virgin Islands, because right before the storm, you created the changes in terms of how we were clustered now together, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, to create some synergies between management and how budgets are done so that we can share resources with one another. But then after the storm, you know, now we also have both of the superintendents have left the area. We have acting superintendents and are beginning to look for permanent superintendents for both the park on St. John and then the park on St. Croix. I mean, I know that Virgin Islanders are really hopeful that whoever is put in place and, you know, the new regional directors begin to talk about the integration of the park as a tourism attraction, but of course also the park as a cultural resource, as a resource to the people on the island, particularly in terms of education.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you're right. It's a challenging time, and it's sad that the timing lined up for those superintendents to leave.
Right.
But I'm hopeful that we can find
I think it's
good
a great
Islanders to
opportunity,
come
right?
back. Exactly. I mean, that's what we need. And we also, I would just say that the Secretary even asked me today about the status of Conneaut Bay. And he's very concerned about getting that work started, getting those people employed again who work there. And so it's a top priority for him.
Well, I introduced legislation in the last month to extend the lease period for Conneaut Bay, recognizing that they were already in the process of renewing their lease, but they need to have sufficient time, in my opinion, to be able to get the financing they need to be able to rebuild in the manner to make it a world-class resort as it was before, so that so many people on St. John as well as St. Thomas are employed by Conneaut Bay.
Yeah, and we're also hoping it might end up in the supplemental, that
language
lease,
itself.
that language, or some ability to
that's
put
a
a
great
lease out
idea. That's a great idea,
for 60
Secretary.
years.
Great. And so you also attended the Centennial Commemoration events last year. Yeah. It seems like, you know, we're in 2018 and we're just fast forwarding, hurricane, et cetera, but we just finished our 100th year Centennial event. And you're also, thankfully, so grateful that you're on the commission, the congressional commission that I have with Senators Murkowski of Alaska, who was born in a territory, born in Alaska before it became a state.
That's a good point.
And also with Senator Rubio, Senator Nelson of Florida, both gentlemen from Florida, Mia Love of Utah, and Tom MacArthur from New Jersey, who's been really helpful to the territory, and myself. So having you on the commission as well is a tremendous addition to do some of the work. And, you know, as we see us entering the next 100 years, what do you think will be ultimately, or what are your thoughts about our relationship going forward, not just with Interior, but with the U.S. itself?
Well, of course, we're all looking forward to a revitalized Virgin Islands, robust economy, and everything we can do to help with that recovery side is the main thing. There were a lot of suffering people, and I know it broke your heart, and so that's the main thing that I think we'd look forward to. And of course, the Virgin Islands they're part of the United States. They are the United States, and getting that message out to people is critically important. I enjoy the Centennial. Was a blast. Of course, we sort of did it twice, once on St. Croix and once on St. Thomas. And the secretary gave the secretary an opportunity in his first month of being here to go down and participate, meet the Danish Prime Minister, and
really understand that history and the relationship.
Oh, that really was amazing. And see the sort of the heritage, the cultural history side was fantastic.
So we're going to be running out of time shortly, but I want to give you an opportunity to discuss anything that you thought was important that we might have missed or I might not have discussed with you.
That's a good question. Can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'd be curious of your thoughts. What do you think? How is the recovery going? You go down there all the time?
All the time.
What do you
I'll be leaving tomorrow to go back home. You know, I think that, and I'm going to actually be having a hearing February 20th and 21st, a field hearing with the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, where I'm the ranking member on the Interior Subcommittee, to talk about the relationship between the federal and the local government in the response and the recovery.
So field hearing down there?
Exactly.
Oh, great.
So we'll be doing a tour of St. Thomas and St. John, and we're actually going to have the hearing with members of Congress on St. John. So that people of the Virgin Islands can see that. And one of the things that I, have noticed, and it's been my observation, is that I think the federal government is doing what it's supposed to do in the manner that it is, in terms of on the ground, boots on the ground. I think that there is sometimes a disconnect between the local and the federal government of whose role is what and how to ask for the appropriate things, when to ask for them, and when they should be deployed. And I think that's going to become even more critical when we talk about the rebuilding and making sure that, now I'm on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, that the Stafford Act, which really determines a lot of the funding, not only takes care of building as it was, but building as it should be, so that there's some fiscal responsibility in the rebuilding and recovery. I know that on St. John, this has been critically important because so much of St. John is in fact federal land. And your relationship and the support that we've been getting from the Department of Interior, I think, is really critical. I have talked with colleagues on both the left and the right side about potentially the support of Interior in the dissemination of the funding that we receive, because I'm very much of a mind that money needs to be going towards our future, not towards our immediate needs. That this is an opportunity for us to build for our children, not just to take care of ourselves today, and that we're not going to have this kind of opportunity again, and we can't squander it. So I think the support of Interior would be, and the technical support that you guys have would really be important for that.
That's great.
So I wanted to thank you for being my guest today on the Washington Report. It's really an honor to have you here, and I'm grateful that you took the time out to talk with people of the Virgin Islands about your thoughts and what you think the recovery was doing and going forward. And at the end, I like to give everybody my words from Stacey. And I wanted to give the residents of the Virgin Islands an update on the recovery efforts after our hurricanes. As you know, the federal government must serve a critical and ongoing role in supporting the people of the Virgin Islands as we recover from persevere through the destruction caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. I'm pleased that my colleagues in Congress have to date appropriated $36.5 billion for emergency disaster relief around the country, but far more is necessary in hurricane-affected areas, especially in places like the Virgin Islands. The catastrophic destruction demands massive amounts of aid for our territory. Our islands have faced enormous neglect in funding in comparison to other areas of America before the storms. For example, while most states receive between 25 to 42 cents for every dollar of revenue, the Virgin Islands receives approximately 14 cents for each of those revenue dollars. I've recently been appointed to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where I'll address the disparity as well as changes to the Stafford Act, which directly affects federal funding for disasters. The scale of damage to the territories is unprecedented, and unless Congress addresses questions of rebuilding and provides funding for technical support in the Department of Interior, and especially 100% Medicaid and Medicare funding support to us, and 100% cost share for the recovery building, as was done in other parts of America, like Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, we will be unable to rebuild properly. This issue, along with the intended and unintended consequences of the recently passed tax bill, will deplete the Virgin Islands tax revenue by anywhere, experts are now saying, from $150 million per year to, at the very minimum, to over $200 million per year in revenues coming into the Virgin Islands General Fund. The Virgin Islands must closely evaluate its relationship with the federal government and press for parity, meaning equality in treatment in terms of our relationship with the federal government. I want to personally thank the first responders and the men and women that came from all over the country to get us back on our feet. And of course, to those Virgin Island first responders that are there on the ground, to put your own families aside for the time that you did to support us. Finally, as a reminder, I'd like to hear from you, my constituents. If you have a question you would like me to answer, please email those questions to askstacy@mail.house.gov. Follow us on social media, and check out my website for further information regarding my offices here in DC or in the Virgin Islands, and keep up with what we're doing here in Washington. Until the next time, good day and thank you.